Social Media and the Choreography of Assembly is a chapter from Paulo Gerbado's book, Tweets and the Streets, Social Media and Contemporary Activism. In this chapter, Gerbado argues that contemporary forms of protest communication, including activist tweets, Facebook, apps, and text messages, revolve to a great extent precisely around acts of choreographing the mediated scene setting and scripting of people's physical assembling in public space. Gerbado challenges Laurie Penny, whose theory around social movements contends that by activists using contemporary social media, social movements can finally become leaderless, horizontal, and spontaneous. Gerbado argues the choreographing of public gatherings in which social media are involved cannot be reduced to the circulation of practical information or the logistics of organizing protest events. The choreography of contemporary movements has its own cultural narrative, and it requires the construction of common collective identifications among participants. Gerbado states that throughout the history of social movements, media like newspapers, radio, and television have contributed in condensing symbolic assemblages which can later materialize into bodily assemblies. The relationship between new technologies and novel means of choreographing crowds and movements is by no means a new phenomenon. It is rather a 20th century story, with the Nazis as particular examples of this. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, argued, quote, "The radio would be for the 20th century what the press was for the 19th century. With this in mind, the Nazi regime understood the power in making state-manufactured radios available to the masses. The radios were subsidized, and by 1938, 65% of households were in possession of a Volksempfänger, or, quote, people's radio. Through this easily accessible form of media and ability to reach the masses with their propaganda, the Nazi regime were able to achieve what theorist Alberto Melucci states as the construction of a collective identity alongside the identification of an enemy, the definition of a purpose and object at stake in a conflict. In areas where the radio was not widely available, we can still see the impact and the effectiveness this form of media had in the choreographing assembly. Gerbado illustrates this by reflecting on philosopher Frantz Fanon's of the role played by the radio stations of the Front de Libération Nationale in organizing the struggle against French colonizers in Algeria. The FLN radio station, Voice of Fighting Algeria, was of capital importance, argues Fanon, in consolidating and unifying the people. Fanon also argues that the radio created a new sense of mediated community among the people, and while previously owning a radio had been considered a sign of complicity with the colonial regime, with the inception of the Voice of Fighting Algeria, the radio, Fanon says, was no longer part of the occupier's arsenal of oppression. On the contrary, for Algerians, having a radio now meant paying one's taxes to the nation, buying the right of entry into the struggle of an assembled people. Gerbado reminds us that what is crucial, however, is that the role of the radio did not stop at the level of creating a symbolic community, but also facilitated the physical gathering of people in public space. The assemblage described by Fanon was not only symbolic, but also physical, since given the scarcity of radios, people would crowd around one set in order to listen together. This coming together of the disparate constituted a fundamental threat for the French colonizer. The spread of these intimate gatherings, in fact, constituted the initial nuclei around which a process of mobilization would form. The radio thus facilitated the material precipitation of the movement and transformation of dissenting publics into protesting crowds. Gerbado argues that the idea of choreography of assembly isn't used to simply highlight the process of physical assembling, but it also refers to such process of mediation expressed in nature of contemporary forms of indirect, emotional, or choreographic leadership which revolve around setting the general scene for participation, leaving participants to creatively navigate the space thus created. Leadership here needs to be understood in general terms as a relatively centralized form of influence over the course of a collective action. With this type of choreographic leadership, where there is no one leader acting as a, quote, figurehead, such as Gandhi or Martin Luther King, it works through a logic of consensus rather than a logic of command. Garbato argues the notion of choreography emphasizes the importance of leaders and leading groups in giving coherence, a common sense of unity, of a place and of direction to collective action. The notion of choreography also allows us to analyze the spatial character of the process of mobilization and the way in which it connects dispersed participants with specific places of gathering. For Malucci, mobilization is the process by which a social movement is created and begins to take action. Garbato argues that the protest camps of the indignados in Spain, of the Egyptian Revolution, and of Occupy Wall Street are marked by a striving for the construction of a sense of centrality and spatial fixity. German philosopher Hannah Arendt argues action never happens in isolation. It always requires the construction of a sense of togetherness among those involved. Arendt goes on to label this notion as the space of appearance. The space of appearance, she says, comes into being wherever men are together in the manner of speech and action. Its peculiarity is that, unlike the spaces which are the work of our hands, it does not survive the actuality of the movement which brought it into being, but disappears not only with the dispersal of men, as in the case of great catastrophes when the body politic of a people is destroyed, but with the disappearance or arrest of the activities themselves. Wherever people gather together, it is potentially there, but only potentially, not necessarily, and not forever. Arendt suggests that public space is not a datum or a material architecture acting as a venue, but rather a form of experience resulting from the process of gathering and its recomposition of a prior situation of dispersion. In other words, Garbato explains, public space needs to be performatively constructed and reconstructed through the act of gathering of otherwise dispersed individuals. Garbato's argument is clear. Social media activism is not the result of swarms or spontaneous leaderless networks. Social movements of the 21st century still need to mobilize people. Garbato stresses the fact that media are being used by real people to organize revolt.